So, next story that we're going to look at in this series, and of course there are many stories that we could look at. So I'm just kind of picking a few of my favorites, I guess. But last week we talked about Abraham and his journey of faith. And tonight we're going to talk about Gideon a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about what we talked about last week, just kind of as a reminder of kind of what's underneath this series, my rationale, the way I like to present it, is thinking about these Old Testament stories perhaps in a little bit different way than we might have before. We need to remember that these narratives are accounts of historical events that are intended to communicate meaning. And so we can't just pay attention to the events, which is what we tend to teach to our children. You know, that's the first place to start. Get the facts, just the facts. We want to tell those events and get people accustomed to them and acquainted with them, but we need to move beyond the events and carefully consider the account in which the events are presented. So tonight I wanted to kind of run through a little bit of history to try to kind of catch us up with where we're at in the Bible, because I'm skipping a lot of years in here between Abraham and Gideon. So Abraham to Moses. We had Abraham last week. We saw that he and Sarah had their son Isaac finally. Isaac's children were Jacob and Esau, and the promise goes down through Jacob and his 12 sons. And you remember the story of Joseph and how they all ended up down in Egypt, and then they were enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years. Moses was born, eventually became their leader and led them on the exodus out of Egypt and on the journey to the promised land. And as the people arrived on the border of the promised land, Moses speaks to them. And a lot of what he said to them is captured in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? So, sorry, I forgot about what my slide was. Had all that stuff there to show you and didn't get it on there. But this is one of the things that we read in Deuteronomy. We read about the Lord's instructions through Abraham to the people of Israel. And this is really important background for what we begin to read later in Joshua and Judges. So this is from chapter 7, and this is characteristic. There's lots of repetitiveness in Deuteronomy around the same themes and ideas, but this is a particularly concise one that captures a lot of the detail in one place. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than yourselves. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. So a couple of things to point out. One is that list of nations. Just kind of file that away and remember it, because you're going to see it again. And then focus on what they were told to do. When the Lord gives them over to you, defeat them, devote them to complete destruction, make no covenants with them, show no mercy. You shall not intermarry with them and therefore follow after their gods. Very, very specific instructions about how to deal with the people in the new land. We skip on over in Deuteronomy to chapter 20 and read this. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destructions. the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. So, some pretty specific, hard to misinterpret instructions. Later on in Deuteronomy, especially in chapters 28 and 30, we read a lot more about the conditional nature of the promise. In chapter 28, God mentions the blessings that they will receive for obedience and the curses that they will receive for disobedience. And all throughout that chapter, there's an emphasis on obey the voice of the Lord. 5 times in that one chapter, that same phrase appears. And among the curses, losing the land, not being able to remain in the land, the promised land. Chapter 30 highlights the point that a single failure is not permanent, that repentance and forgiveness are possible. How? In verses 2, 8, 10, and 20, obey the voice of the Lord. Right? So, God wants obedience from his people. It's in their best interest all around to listen to his voice. So all of this is in the background as Joshua leads the people into the promised land. Now Joshua replaces Moses as the leader, and the conquest of the promised land begins. The book of Joshua tends to portray this conquest very positively. Take a look at this from Joshua chapter 21. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. But if you had read Joshua from the beginning all the way up to this particular part that I just read to you, there's also some fairly worrisome foreshadowing too. For example, the first major story when they enter the land, they go toward Jericho, right? And they make a covenant with Rahab. What did we read in Deuteronomy? Make no covenants. And almost the first thing they do once they cross the Jordan and enter the promised land, they make a covenant. We can go on down through chapter 9. Hivites remain. In chapter 11, it says, now none of the Anakim remained, except in several places, right? In chapter 13, there was much land yet to be possessed. Even when Joshua was old, they did not possess certain people from the land. And so the Jebusites remain, the Canaanites remain. We see that several different times, right? So these occasional statements spark memories of their instructions in Deuteronomy and the conditional nature of God's promises. But in fact, the worrisome statements made earlier in the book are later confirmed explicitly. When Joshua pleads with Israel towards the end of the book, he knows he's about to die. These last couple of chapters are kind of his version of Deuteronomy in one sense. Remember, Moses wasn't allowed to enter the promised land. And so on the edge of the promised land, he speaks all these speeches that we have recorded in Deuteronomy to the people, and then he dies. At the end of Joshua, Joshua speaks to the people, and then he's going to die very soon thereafter. And what does he focus on when he talks to them? Well, he says, is God really going to be your God? Right? And we all remember the famous statement that he made, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. But he pleads with them. And one of the final things that he says in chapter 24, verse 23 is this: then put away the foreign gods that are among you. Right? They're already engaging in idolatry. before Joshua's even dead. Right? And so those worrisome statements that we heard earlier in the book about them not really taking the land, and are they really trusting God, and are they doing what he told them to do? We know that they're not with regard to utterly destroying and getting rid of the people who were in the land. And now we know in chapter 24 of Joshua that in fact they actually are worshiping foreign gods. So the seeds of doubt are planted, and the question becomes, is Israel truly going to possess the land? And if they actually take all of it, are they going to be able to stay there? Or will they break the covenant with God and be taken away from the good land that he provided to them? Well, as we get into sorry, double slide there somehow. As we get into Judges, the problems that we read about in Joshua don't go away. In fact, they actually get worse. Although the first verses seem kind of promising. At the beginning of Judges chapter 1, they inquired of the Lord. They didn't just go do whatever they wanted to do. They inquired of the Lord, and he told them what to do. And Judah and Simeon got together and went after some Canaanites and defeated them. And that all seems pretty good, but not for long, because when we get into the middle part of chapter 1 and toward the end, we find out that Judah fails to drive out everyone, and Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites, and the house of Joseph made a treaty with a man from Luz, and Manasseh fails to drive everybody out, and so does Ephraim and Zebulun and Asher and Naphtali and Dan. In short order, between verses 19 and 34, we read about all these failures of the people to drive the people who were in the land before out. Remember that list, right, that we looked at back in Deuteronomy. Those people are still hanging around because Israel has not driven them out. So early in chapter 2, there's a visitation from the angel of the Lord. And the angel rebukes Israel. He tells them all the things that they're doing wrong. And in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, we see the people's response. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. And they called on the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. So it sounds like when confronted by the angel with what they were doing or failing to do, they repented. They wanted to do better. So they wept, they sacrificed to the Lord. And so there's a little bit of hope that is raised by their response. But then we read this in chapter 2, verse 10. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. This is after Joshua dies. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, or the work that he had done for Israel. Now that doesn't sound promising. When a new generation arises and they don't know who the Lord is and they don't know what he has done for them, we're getting ready to have a problem, right? So we're a little bit concerned if we're reading carefully. Things don't sound like they're going well. And then we read the rest of chapter 2. And I think it's important enough that I want to read it, even though it's a pretty long section here. I want to read it to us so that we can see things from God's perspective about what is happening with Israel. Starting in verse 11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their surrounding enemies so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. And whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did, or not. So the Lord left those nations, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. One of the reasons I wanted to read that was just to show, we're getting a lot of information here from the Lord's perspective about what's happening in Israel. What are the people doing or not doing? And the second reason I wanted to read it is because it shows the pattern that we're going to see over and over and over again in Judges. Israel does what's evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord gives them over to oppressors. Israel cries out to the Lord. The Lord raises up a deliverer or a judge. The deliverer defeats the oppressor. And then the land has rest. That's the standard pattern. Sometimes not all elements of the pattern are there, and usually they're conspicuously absent. And they tell us something important by their absence. That will be especially true in the story that we look at next week, which is the story of Samson later on in Judges. Right? But here we see the pattern established. And so in chapter 3, we read more about what these nations that are left still there in the land, and it concludes in verses 5 and 6, kind of the introduction of the whole book, chapter 1 through 3:6. But in the last two verses, chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, so the people of Israel lived among who? The Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Right? Those people that God specifically told them in Deuteronomy, show no mercy, utterly destroy them. But what is happening? They're living among them. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they served their gods. Exactly what God said would happen if they did not obey is happening. They failed to drive out, and they intermarried, and now they're abandoning God and serving the false gods of the land that they have come into. Okay, so these first three chapters, or the first two and the beginning of the third chapter in Judges, are mostly set up for what's to come. There's not a whole lot of dialogue in there. It's just the narrator telling us, kind of getting us up to speed. But there are lots of things in these chapters that should remind us of Moses in Deuteronomy, and we should be keyed into the fact that there are probably going to be problems ahead. This is not going well. In fact, the book opens with the tribes cooperating to defeat Canaanites and ends with tribes cooperating to go to war against one of their own. If you remember the story later on of Micah and the idols and all the fallout from that in the last few chapters of Judges, they open by fighting together against the enemy they're supposed to defeat. The book ends in more or less civil war. They band together to fight one of their own brothers. Right? This is not a positive thing. And with that, we move on into the judge stories that fill out the bulk of the book. The first one we come to is Othniel in chapter 3, verse 7. He's kind of the ideal judge or the model judge. He's useful to compare against those who follow that we read more about later in the book. In his story, these elements that I have on the screen right now, this judges cycle where Israel does what's evil in the sight of the Lord gives over to oppressors, all those things happen. Boom, 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 boom in the story of Othniel. And when the Spirit of the Lord comes on Othniel, he goes up and defeats his enemies and the land has rest. It's exactly as it should be. Most of the other stories in Judges depart from that pattern in one way or another, sometimes in multiple ways, and it usually is commentary on a problem with the judge or the people that the judge is trying to work with. Anyway, Othniel. Then we go to Ehud, Deborah, and Barak. And there's a lot more we could talk about in terms of Judges as a whole, but that sets us up pretty well for the story of Gideon, which plays a central role in Judges. You may remember probably the most famous story from within the broader story of Gideon is Gideon and the fleeces, right? He puts the fleece out. He wants the fleece to be wet and the ground dry, and the ground to be wet and the fleece dry. He tests God and so forth. And that's the image that I have up here as our kind of flannelgraph reminder. Let's look more carefully at the story of Gideon, starting in chapter 6. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. All right, so there's our first two elements of the pattern. They did what was evil. The Lord gave them into the hand of their enemies. We read a little bit further, and we find out that when the Midianites come, they come in huge numbers, and they destroy the land. They take all the crops from the Israelites. And so we get down to the end of verse 6, and we read, and the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. There's the third element of our pattern, right? They've done what is evil. Sorry, my dog is having an itch and scratching. I hope it's not too disturbing. And the Lord gave them into the hand, and now they've cried out to help. And if we've been reading carefully from the beginning, what should we expect to happen next? You remember the pattern? We've done the first three here, and Israel cries out to the Lord. What should happen next? The Lord should raise up a judge. Let's see what happens. Verse 7, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel. And he said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I led you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. Remember what I emphasized back there in chapters 28 and 30 of Deuteronomy? Over and over and over again, almost 10 times in 2 chapters. Obey the voice of the Lord. And what does the prophet come and say? You have not obeyed my voice. Nonetheless, there is going to be a judge. So let's take a look in chapter 6, verse 11, where we meet Gideon for the first time. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Now, you have to at least consider the possibility that this is sarcasm, right? I mean, what do you think about this angel calling Gideon a mighty man of valor? We've just been told he was hiding food, as he was threshing the grain. He was beating out the wheat in a winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So he's not out there in the open. He's not bold and brave like we might think of it. And so when I read about the angel calling him a mighty man of valor, I think the title is at odds with Gideon's behavior, at least at this moment. And I believe that subsequent events also provide more evidence that Gideon is indeed a fearful man, not a mighty man of valor, at least when we meet him right now. So verse 13, and Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?' But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian." Now, if Gideon really understood the covenant, he wouldn't need to ask this question, would he? What has the prophet just said to the people of Israel? You haven't obeyed the voice of the Lord. What was the covenant dependent upon? Them listening to the voice of the Lord and obeying. But he does ask the question which raises another question. Why didn't he know why all this was happening? And again, if we are reading big chunks and reading carefully from the beginning, we probably would remember what we read together in chapter 2, verse 10. And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel. Right? Why didn't they know? Think about that a little bit. Also consider this. Does Gideon know who he is speaking with? He addresses him politely. You might think otherwise because it's, when I read it, he said, "Please, sir." Some translations will say, "Please, Lord." But when his use of Lord there is not Lord as in God, it's Lord as in sir. It's a polite term. But does he know he's speaking with the angel of the Lord? Let's keep going for right now. Gideon probably regretted speaking at all after he heard what the angel says next. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you?" Now listen to Gideon's response and see if what he says sounds familiar in any way. And he said to him, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." Does that sound familiar at all? Have you heard anybody speak like that before? Who does it remind you of? I see, Dub, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I remember David saying that.
Okay. Now that's, chronologically that's future, but that is another place in the Bible where we read that. I was kind of being drawn backwards in time, trying to think of somebody who tried to weasel out of doing what God wanted him to do.
Moses.
Yeah, it really reminds me of Moses. In fact, Moses really goes a little bit further even than Gideon does. I mean, he kept after God about that for a chapter and a half. Gideon's going to give up after a couple of verses. But this reminds me of Moses. Right? But I'm going to ask again, does he know who he's talking with? I don't think so. Not quite yet. But let's keep going. And the Lord said to him, but I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. Now listen to how it goes from here and what Gideon says. And he said to him, if now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Please do not depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you. And he said, I will stay till you return. What did the angel say to Gideon that caused him to go, oh, you might be somebody really important. Give me a sign that it really is you who speak with me.
Well, he says, give me when God answers, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites. I think he got the clue then.
Okay, so the key words there probably are what?
I will be with you.
I will be with you.
I will be with you. Guess what God said to Moses in Exodus 3 when he called him? But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, but I will be with you. That's Exodus 3, 11 and 12. I think that when Gideon heard these words, he goes, the light bulb goes off. I will be with you. I know who says that kind of thing. Wait a minute. I need to test you. Okay, so let's see how Gideon responds. He wants a sign, right? Please don't depart from here until I come to you and bring out my present and set it before you. He said, I'll stay. So Gideon went into his house and prepared a young goat and unleavened cakes from an ephah of flour. The meat he put in a basket, and the broth he put in a pot, and brought them to him under the terebinth and presented them. And the angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened cakes and put them on this rock and pour the broth over them. And he did so. And the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes. And fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. Then Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. And Gideon said, alas, O Lord God. Okay, he's not saying sir anymore. Right? O Lord God, for now I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace be to you, do not fear, you shall not die. Then Gideon built an altar there to the Lord and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day, it still stands at Ophrah, which belongs to the Abiezrites. All right, remember this. He built an altar in his clan's home. This is important. All right, Gideon's first task and its fallout. We have a relatively rare case here of the narrator stepping into the story and explaining the main character's motivation. In verse 25, the Lord comes to him and says, I want you to tear down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah that's beside it. And so Gideon took 10 men of his servants in verse 27 and did as the Lord told him. But because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night. He was afraid. And it turns out, from a human point of view, at least, his fear was justified, because when we read what happens in the next verses, when the men of the town discover this, they want to bring out whoever, they want to find whoever did it, and they want to kill him. All right. Now think about this. These are Israelites who are angry about the desecration of their place of idol worship. And they want to kill the man who did it. But Gideon's father intercedes, and he says, who will you contend for Baal? Verse 31, or will you save him? Whoever contends for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because his altar has been broken down. Therefore, on that day, Gideon was called Jerubbaal. That is to say, let Baal contend against him, because he broke down his altar. So Gideon gets a new name, and he has had a relatively successful first job, a first task as the judge that God has brought to rescue Israel from their foes. Well, in the next few verses, we read that the Midianites and the Amalekites come. They're gathering and encamping in the land. Verse 34, but the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet and called people to follow him. And they did. Right? But then we have the verses at the end of the chapter, verses 36 through 40. Then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he arose early next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung out enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. This is a good example of how Hebrew narrative is subtle. The narrator doesn't evaluate in any way Gideon's decision to test the Lord, not once, but twice. But there's little doubt that this action portrays Gideon negatively. This will become increasingly obvious the further we read into Judges. More about this next week. There's a plug for you. But now, remember what happened in the previous verses. In verse 34, but the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. Now look back at the ideal judge, Othniel, in chapter 3, verse 10. The Spirit of the Lord was on him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave, big word, can't pronounce, king of Mesopotamia into his hand, and his hand prevailed over this other king. Remember how I talked about Othniel being kind of the model, ideal judge? When the Spirit of the Lord comes on Othniel, he does exactly what God asked him to do without question or complaint. And he is successful in getting it done. What happens when the Spirit of the Lord comes on Gideon? He ought to have all the sign he needs, right? He has the Spirit of the Lord, and he wants a sign. And in fact, he doesn't want one, he wants two. Again, if we read further into Judges, this will become even more obvious. The Spirit of the Lord comes on Jephthah, and he makes a rash vow. Later on in the story of Samson, which we'll look at in more detail next week, the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and he goes to see a prostitute. I mean, it's back to back. It's stated like that as you read. We're going downward here. Othniel, the Spirit of the Lord came on him, And he went out and did exactly what God did and got the result that God promised. Gideon, the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and he calls an army together, but then he tests God twice. Keep that in mind. So Gideon led his army toward the invaders, and they camped, and we move into chapter 7. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.' Now, therefore, proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead.' Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained." And I'm a little bit surprised that Gideon was among the people who remained, right? He's the one who's fearful all the time, and he's going to keep being fearful. I'm not reading into it. I'm reading out of it. And the Lord said to Gideon, "The people are still too many." So now they go down to the water, and there's a whole thing about how they drink. And 300 of them do it one way, and the rest of them do it another. And God says, the 300 are good enough for me. Send everybody else home. All right. So now we're down to verse 9. And here's another example of subtlety. This time the narrator doesn't say Gideon is afraid, but his fear is evident by his actions in relation to what the Lord says. Listen to this, verse 9. That same night the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp." Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. Why did he take Purah? It was in the words that God said, "If you're afraid, take Purah." He took Purah. He's afraid. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And when Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade, and he said, "Behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat." And his comrade answered, "This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp." Now, this is a Midianite saying this. All right, so the Lord has reassured Gideon with this. And what is Gideon's response? As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshiped, right? Remember when the angel disappeared and then the Lord said, "It's okay, you're not going to die." He built an altar. He worshiped. Here, God makes good on what he said would happen. God said, if you go down there, you're going to be encouraged. Your hand shall be strengthened. Sure enough, he was. He builds he worships here as well. And he returned to the camp and called them out and said, "Hey, let's get going." He divided the 300, verse 16, he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into their hands of all of them and empty jars and torches inside the jars. And he said to them, "Look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Wait a minute. Where did that come from? For the Lord and for Gideon? How do you read that? Does that sound like a positive thing? It's hard for me not to read it as evidence of inappropriate pride. Who is this supposed to be for? If we look back in chapter 7, verse 2, the people with you are too many, God says. send a bunch of these folks home, lest the people say, my own hand has saved me. I want them to know that I'm the one who saved them. And Gideon kind of inserts himself into it. It says, for the Lord and for Gideon. Well, in the interest of time, because we're already only about 10 minutes from time, he defeats them. The camp goes into disarray. They turn on each other. When the men break their pots and show their fire, it scatters them, and they fight each other, and then the Israelites pursue them even further from there. And we read in verse 22, when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as so-and-so, as far as the border. Who did this? It's the Lord. It's the Lord. Right? The Lord brought about victory, and everybody is happy, right? Well, no. We get into chapter 8, and the first 9 verses of that is mostly about internal squabbles. Ephraim is upset with Gideon that he didn't invite them to the party. And so they chastise him, and he has a really politically astute response. He says, hey, look what you did when you did come. You've done more than me, whether I invited you or not. You know, what's the big deal? So he was able to talk himself out of that. Interestingly, Gideon is from Manasseh, and this is Ephraim he's having a problem with. If you know your history, you know those are the 2 sons of Joseph. So sibling rivalry here in the tribal form. When they cross the Jordan and go over and continue their pursuit, they end up in Gad. And 2 different cities in Gad don't help Gideon and his army. They refuse to give them food and lodging because they haven't caught those kings yet. And so they don't want to aid the wrong side. They're hedging their bets as to who's going to win this. Right? And so what does he say in these verses? So Gideon said in verse 7, when I come back after capturing these, after the Lord has given these men into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And when the people in Penuel said something of the same sort, he says, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. That doesn't sound very peaceful to me, by the way. There's some wordplay going on there, I think. Right? But does this sound like the same Gideon who was hiding in a wine press to thresh his grain? I don't think so. Is that a good thing? I don't think so, because I've read the rest of the story. Let's keep going. So they're fighting with their own people. Even if they should have aided them willingly when he asked, it's still not a good thing to be fighting with his own people. All right, when we get into the end or the middle of chapter 8 here, when he finally captured those kings and he asked them, verse 18, where are the men whom you killed at Tabor? They answered, as you are, so they were. Every one of them resembled the son of a king. Remember this king talk. Okay. His son was afraid to kill them, so Gideon arose and killed them. And he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. Right? But then we have some troubling developments. Verse 22, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Now, who had saved them from the hand of Midian? Even the Midianites knew it was the Lord. Through Gideon, yes, but it was the hand of the Lord who did it. Why did he send all those people home? So that people would not draw this conclusion. And yet they have anyway. For you have saved us, they say. But that's simply not true. How does Gideon respond? Verse 23, he said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Okay, that sounds really good. And we say, all right, Gideon's got it. It's all good. But we have to keep reading. Look at the next verses. And Gideon said to them, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from his spoil, for they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in his earrings and threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels. That's a little over 40 pounds by my math. Little over 40 pounds of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city of Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more, and the land had rest 40 years in the days of Gideon. So we end our cycle. He's victorious, and the land has rest. Now, besides the idolatry, which we'll come back to right at the very end, why is this a problem? The other things that we read about here. What's all this business with the gold, and why is that kind of a warning sign?
He's creating an idol.
So he's going to use it to make an idol, very much as who?
Aaron.
Aaron did back in Genesis. So we've had our references to Moses and to Aaron within this story. But accepting tribute is also something a king would do. And in fact, in Deuteronomy 17, where we read about what a bad king will do, one of the things that he will do is acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Right? So we do go on down and we find that the enemy was defeated, the land had rest, and so we have the rest of the elements of the cycle, and the story is over, right? No. Verse 29. Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and lived in his own house. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he called his name Abimelech. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash, his father, at Ophrah of the Abiezrites. We're up against it, so I'm gonna cut to the chase here. This is more bad king stuff. Deuteronomy 17, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Right? And if you think I'm kind of stretching it here a little bit, I've got one more piece of information. What does the name Abimelech mean? It means, my father is king. Do we need to reevaluate Gideon's words in chapter 8, verse 23? He said, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. But his actions say something different. He takes many wives. He takes excessive gold. He names his son, my father is king. And the cycle begins again, right? As soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and so forth. So we think there's going to be another judge. But if we were to read further, we discover that Abimelech assumes the office of his father, much as a king's son would. And in the end, Israel needs deliverance from him, not the other way around. He's the anti-judge. Right? Well, let's wrap this up. Gideon built an altar to the Lord in Ophrah at the beginning of the story. And at the end of the story, he cast a golden idol and placed it in the same city. The same man tore down an idol and erected one in his hometown. He told the angel he was too insignificant to be the Lord's instrument, yet he assembled 32,000 men to fight. and then sent all but 300 of them home. But then he commanded the remaining soldiers to do their work for the Lord and for Gideon. This seems presumptuous to me, especially in light of the Lord's reason for using so few men. That's why he sent all those folks home, so that they wouldn't say, my own power has delivered me. And so at the end of the story, it's ironic that the people attribute the victory not to the Lord, but to Gideon. And Gideon's words and actions again reflect a divided soul. He refuses to formally become king and identifies the Lord as the true king, yet he behaves like a bad king, going so far as to name one of his children, my father is king. I think Gideon provides insight into the mind of ordinary Israelites at this time. He knows about the Lord, but he doesn't understand the covenant. He voices the question I think many people are asking, if the Lord is with us, why is all this happening to us? He's fearful. His faith wavers depending on how recently the Lord has passed one of his tests. He is prideful, even after being privy to God's rationale for using only a tiny portion of the army that he assembled. In a word, he's flawed. Yet the reliable, omniscient narrator closes the story with these words in verse 35 of chapter 8. They did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done to Israel. The Lord used this flawed man to accomplish good. And did you notice how he was named here? Jerubbaal. That's the name he was given when he tore down that altar to Baal in the very early part of the story. Is it one last reminder, perhaps, that the greatest good he accomplished was the first thing he did as judge? That he tore down an altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah pole in his hometown and earned the name he contends with Baal? And that's the last way he is named in this story of his time as judge. I think it's an interesting thought. So he is an enigma. He's a flawed guy. And we see more through his story about how the people are turning further and further and further and further away from God. They're not listening to the voice of the Lord. They're not obeying the voice of the Lord. They're pursuing their own path. And there's a sense in which this cycle in Judges is actually a cycle that spins downward. It goes from bad to worse. Right? And we'll see more of that next week in the story of Samson. I'm sorry, I went over again a little bit tonight, and I've been talking a lot. Any comments before we call it a meeting for the evening? All right. I'm not hearing anybody, so.
Well, that was another good lesson, Bruce. Appreciate that. I guess I came out of this thing with a little different view of Gideon than I had.
Yeah.
Because I one time remember preached a lesson on this idea of humility, being the least, and I included him in there.
Yeah, he started there. But I think his experiences led him to have an inappropriate pride.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was characterized initially by fear and later by brashness, as if it was because of him that these things happened rather than God.
Mm-hmm.
So he was fearful. His faith wavered, as I said, depending on how recently God passed one of his tests. And he was prideful, eventually taking on the airs of a bad king, according to what is written in Deuteronomy 17. And so, I don't want to say he's just a terrible, no good, very bad person, right? The main thing I draw from it is not so much about him. He's flawed, just like all of us are. In some form or fashion. We might not have exactly the same flaws, but we are equally flawed before the Lord. But the Lord used him for good. The narrator tells us at the end of the story that he did accomplish good for Israel. But our eyes shouldn't be on Gideon as an example, as a positive example, be more like Gideon. Our eyes should be on God to see, wow, look what God can do, even when he doesn't have perfect people to work with. And if you think Gideon has a few flaws, let's wait till next week and we get into Samson. We're going to get further down into the bad characteristics of a human being as we look at Samson.